And welcome. My name is Morgan Denton. I'm an English Language Arts Specialist, Maine Department of Education. I'm thrilled to see all of you here today to join us for this first session of a text study based on grading for equity by Joe Feldman. Just a few details, a little bit of housekeeping, if you will. At the end of this session, I will post a link to a feedback form. And what you should do is go to that feedback form, complete the feedback for us. We really appreciate that. And at the end, you will get a thank you message with the URL, which is how you get your certificate for participation. So my suggestion is copy that URL and paste it right into your browser, and you'll be able to get your certificate for contact hours. Please know that I will send you a message. So I do apologize. You got the message that I sent to another group. I put it on the wrong list. So you got to see what I do after a session. I will send you a message with the link to today's recording, with the link to the feedback form for contact hours, and anything else you may need to know. So with that said, I think I've taken care of my house cleaning, and I'm going to pass the baton. I'm thrilled, and let me tell you, I am not exaggerating. I cannot properly say how thrilled I am to pass off to Patty Forrester, teacher from Camden Hills. I'm sure she'll tell you a whole lot more about herself and why she is doing this. All right, she's going to tell you who she is and why she's doing it. How about that?
Okay, yeah, so as we get going here, I'm going to share my screen. I'll tell you a little bit about myself, my interest in grading. I teach English at Camden Hills High School, and I taught middle school for 27 years before that. And hold on, ooh, I clicked the wrong button. Oh. In my shift from middle school to high school, I found when I came here, there were a lot of kids failing. And that was a real struggle for me. I hadn't experienced so many kids failing before. So I started to investigate and consider changing my grading practices. And so it's been about a 7-year journey learning about grading. And when I came across grading for equity last fall, I was just totally amazed and impressed with it. The information that's in this book is incredible, and so much food for thought and things to try. It doesn't mean you have to do everything that is in this book, but there are just so many great suggestions as well as information to help us understand why we might consider changing some of our grading practices. So let's get going with it then. So this is how we'll do the webinar for today. I'm going to give you some chapter previews. Some people may have read some already. If you're like me, I get super excited and jump right into the book. But if you haven't read yet, that's okay. So I'm going to do some previewing of the prologue and chapter 1 and chapter 2, and we're going to do some breakout groups. And so that will look like this. I'll do a little presentation, and then we'll have a breakout group. I'll do another presentation and another breakout group. But I'd also like if you use the chat to just think and process your ideas. A couple of authentic engagement agreements I want to make with you. Number one, I'm going to try keep my presentations from not being too long and wordy. No guarantees, but I'm going to try. I ask that you mute while I'm presenting and that you turn your video off. There is no reason for you to have your video on right now. Get out of that Zoom. I have to hold my head straight and keep my neck straight. I can't see you, and I'm just presenting to my computer screen right now. So please turn your video off and sit back and relax a little bit. Secondly, again, use the chat box. As I'm going through some of this information, it might be new to some of you who haven't read the book, this part of the book yet. Post your thoughts or your questions or epiphanies that come up as I'm speaking as a way to process for yourself. And if you're not into that, take notes and process, or not at all and just listen. And finally, with the breakout groups, I know that everyone will engage in the thinking and the sharing and the listening that we'll do together. So the first thing I want to do is look at this chart that's in the prologue. This is a comparison of, hold on. Okay, this is a comparison of the 3 math teachers at a school. And some things that I noticed I put there in the corners, but if you would post in the chat, what do you notice about this chart? So I'm going to give you just a second to post. What do you notice about this chart? I'm pull my chat up here too. We can see as people are posting. What do you notice? 3 math teachers at the same school. Yep, we've got some inconsistencies. Oh my gosh, it's posting so fast. Thank you, folks, for posting the variables. Yes, the scores are glaringly different. I cannot believe there are 70% of the students with A's in teacher one's class, but teacher two only gives 14%. And even more disturbing for me, on the other end, 11% of teacher three's kids are failing. Yes, I know, it's crazy. So let's look at this next chart. Hope it's not too fast, but this is similar. These are the English teachers. The English teachers, same school, 3 different English teachers teaching the same subject. Again, post what you notice, what it makes you think about. It makes me doubt the practices of these teachers. Oh, yeah, interesting. These are all middle school. Somebody asked what level they're at. These were, I forget which grade, but I know it was middle school teachers at the same school. Not fair to students. What the F? Oh, so true. Okay. So let's look at a little bit more detail about these teachers in the school and these students to consider. So I'm going to close the chat here. You can keep posting in it if you want. But this is the information that Joe Feldman shares. This is all in the prologue. All of these classes for both these teachers, they had similar students, similar standardized test scores, similar instruction, same curriculum, the same assessments were given, and they did a team scoring of the assessments. And yet, such a vast difference in the grades that were given to kids. So what varied between those classes? And this is what's really important. One teacher didn't accept homework after the bell. Some teachers gave late penalties from 2 points to 2-letter grades. One teacher took off points for no heading. One teacher took off points if the paper had ripped edges or holes. Some of them used weightings for the grade categories, and those weightings varied from teacher to teacher. And some teachers didn't use weighting, but adjusted points based on the size of the assignment. And so these grading practices are what made those grades so inequitable. So Feldman says in an article that I've linked in the slideshow, which you'll have access to later, the article is called Accurate and Equitable Grading. It's posted on the National School Boards Association's page. He says that grades reflect the teacher's specific grading practices as well as the student's achievement. But my question is, should they, or should they just be reflecting the student's achievement? And most importantly, and as we go through the study together over the course of time, is always have this question, this guiding question at the forefront, and what's best for students? And I always come back to this, and not just what's best for students, but what's best for all students. So when we start to talk about grading practices at school, I'm sure some of you have experienced this. It's not an easy conversation. So many educators do not like discussing grades or grading. It's that elephant in the room many times. And it gets super touchy. And I think that Feldman does such an incredible job of helping us understand why that is. And he talks about grading being a part of teachers' identities. He describes it as the island of autonomy, this one place that teachers feel that they have control. And that he explains is thanks in some part to unions and state policies that say that, administrators can't change a teacher's grade, but there should be some consistency and control in the practices that create the grades. So Feldman says every teacher makes very different choices, and this is part of the problem. He says, because each teacher's grading system is virtually unregulated and unconstrained, a teacher's grading policies and practices reveal how she defines and envisions her relationship with students, what she predicts best prepares them for success, her beliefs about students, and her self-concepts as a teacher. And I would add also to this that it also our grading practices are part of our beliefs about learning and how we believe students learn. So this idea of grading, he says is connected to this thing called the web of belief. And this was this term was coined by philosopher W.V. Quine in 1978. And he says that it's based on our experiences and our prior understanding, these things that we believe. So when you think about teachers and their beliefs about grading, it comes from their past experiences and their prior understanding. He says a complex system of what we hold to be true in the world based on our experiences and prior understanding. That's what a web of belief is. And so this is interesting that when our grading experiences and understandings are questioned, we do everything we can to hang on to that foundation. I have talked to teachers about their grading and they have pushed back to try to build that back the way they believe it should be based on those prior experiences, prior understandings. And it is a lot like a web. And like I had the cool opportunity to watch this spider who created her web in our kitchen window last summer, and it was beautiful. And the next morning it was all torn apart. And that spider worked so hard to put it back together the same way and to rebuild it, but it didn't come out exactly the same. And yet it still worked, and it might have worked better because it continued to catch more creatures, and she had to rebuild and rebuild and rebuild. And that's what we need to do with our web of belief instead of hanging on to those past experiences. So we're going to get ready to go into our first breakout group. And here's some factors for success. Number one, when you go into these groups, if one person will please take on the role of facilitator. And what I've noticed in these groupings is there are people who are very comfortable with taking on this role, and there are people who are not. So if you're comfortable with the role of facilitator, please take it. And all I ask of the facilitator is to pick who should speak and pick who should go next, just to keep it moving. And then that we could have a timekeeper, and that timekeeper, your role is to make sure that it's fair. So our first group will be 3 people for 7 minutes. So it's about 2 minutes per person with a little bit of wiggle room. And finally, that everyone is engaged in listening fully and sharing as you're thinking about the prompt. And something that I just heard about this particular week, I was listening to a Brene Brown podcast called Unlocking Us. And she was interviewing Priya Parker, the author of The Art of Gathering, who said that when we have gatherings, when we bring people together like we are in these breakout groups, that you should take generous authority in that group. And I loved that term, generous, like to take authority in a group and keep us on task and keep us moving as a facilitator or a timekeeper. That is a generous thing because it makes space for everybody. So please take on this role and be generous to the whole group. So here we go. This is the first discussion question. I want you to explore your grading web of belief. And you're just going to talk for up to 2 minutes and share with the group and think about where your beliefs about grading began to form. And maybe who taught you how to grade and when was that? And how long ago? Like for me, it was a long time ago. And have you changed any of your beliefs about grading since then, or have you held on to them? And if so, why? So there's lots of possibilities. You could answer one of these questions or all of them. It's really up to you. So at this point, I'm going to ask Morgan, our master behind the scenes, to put us into these breakout groups. And we will have them be for, like I said, about 7 minutes. So that's about 2 minutes per person with 3 in a group.
Thank you, Patty.
Thank you. Yeah. So folks, what I'd love for you to do is post in the chat how many years ago you think you learned how to grade. So I know that I was a teacher's assistant in high school and I helped my teacher do her grades. So that was a long time ago. I have to think a minute. Okay, I don't know. It was like 35 years ago. So post in the chat, how many years ago do you think you learned about grading? Go ahead and post that in the chat. And while people are posting in the chat, like how long they learned to grade, I'm gonna call on someone to share. Oh, isn't that awful? Okay, I'm gonna call on, are you guys nodding your head? Don't call on me. How about, how about Sherry Templeton? Would you share who taught you how to grade and when that was? You would have to unmute.
You know, I knew you were going to call on me.
How'd you know that?
Just had a sense. I didn't go through a traditional education course. Course of study, I got my science degree and took a long-term sub position, and that counted as my student teaching. And then I had to pick up a couple education courses. So the teaching, the grading practice that I utilized initially came from how I was taught in probably junior high and high school, along with statistics courses that I had in undergrad.
Yeah. Now, if I had thought about this ahead of time, I would have done a poll like, how many of us haven't really changed the way we grade since we started teaching? Because that would be a super interesting poll, but I didn't go there. But I do have colleagues that are still teaching the same way, grading the same way that they graded when they started teaching. And some of them learned from their high school teachers, and those high school teachers learned from their high school teachers. So imagine how far back those grading practices go. All right, so let's move on a little here. So I'm going to keep giving a little bit of a preview of the information from chapters 1 and 2, because some people didn't read ahead of time, and that's awesome. Go ahead and read after. We'll ask you to read these chapters. So he goes on to talk about the technical and theoretical concepts that we need to bring together when we're thinking about grading and grading practices. And he explains the technical as the how of the grading practices, how we do it, and the theoretical as the why behind these practices. And I think as educators, we often don't think about the why. Like I did my national board certification a couple of years ago, and part of that is actually explaining why you do things. And I'd been teaching 25 years, and I had no idea why I did the things I did. I just did them. So it was really interesting to slow down and actually think about the why. And I think that's what's so incredible about this book, is it helps us to do that. So in the technical part, he will be sharing with us information that will teach us how we can implement changes required for time for grading, the messaging of grading, the assessment design, and using gradebook software. There will be some successful, concrete examples shared in the book, as well as struggles and successes. And I know that for myself, when I tried out some things in the books, I had some struggles and I reverted back to what I did. And then I tried it again and it felt better. So there's kind of a back and forth when teachers are working on changing these web of beliefs that we have about grading practices. And then with the theoretical, we will be getting a lot more information from this book with current research-based knowledge about the purpose of grading and the inequities in grading, messages of current grading practices that are given to both students and the stakeholders like parents, administration, school boards, community. And we'll, most importantly, towards the end of the book, we'll get more equitable practices and how they can improve assessments and curriculum design and instructional decisions that we make. So the book is designed like this. Part 1, there's the foundations, grading identity and history. Part 2, he makes a really good case for why we need to change with the current practices and the inequities that they create. And then part 3, he actually presents the practices in a variety of ways. So for more equitable grading practices, there are some things that he recommends. Number 1, that they are accurate and mathematically sound. And I know for myself, I'm an English teacher. I never thought about the mathematics to grading, but when I read that part, that data blew me away. Number 2, that more equitable grading practices will support hope and a growth mindset. And so many of our kids come to us already shut down about how they feel about school and learning. And if our grades continue to add to that, that's a problem. Instead, we need to build hope for them and a growth mindset to learn and succeed and fail and learn from failure. 3, that they would lift the veil on how to succeed. And that's about teacher clarity. You know, if we are more clear with how they can succeed in their learning, we will have more success with them. Hattie's research shows teacher clarity is a like a 0.74 effect size, which is almost double the average amount of learning in a year. And number 4, that more equitable grading practices can help build soft skills, those skills we want them to have that some teachers are grading them on, and actually can motivate kids instead of demotivate them. And finally, the 5th one, that more equitable grading practices value knowledge, not environment or behavior. So at the end of chapter 1, he kind of likes to give a little final word at the end of his chapters. So he leaves us with this message at the end of chapter 1. As we learn new ideas, let us be open, humble, honest, and forgive ourselves if we weren't aware that things could be different. And I just want to touch on each part of that. We should be open to the ideas and the possibilities that he's presenting to us to consider. Humble, that we do not know all of the answers. Honest with what is true, especially because so much is backed by research and science today. And forgive ourselves is really important. I can think of times in my career where I was doing things as a teacher in my grading practices that were not equitable. And I need to forgive myself for that because I know better now and I do better now. So moving into chapter 2 is pretty fascinating. It's a brief history of grading, which I never learned. I have to say that you know, especially if you're a secondary educator, there are no classes on how to grade in college when you're becoming a teacher. So really learning about the history of grading and its evolution, I think can really help transform people's ideas about grading. So he shares in this chapter the changes in American society that have influenced education and grading. He shares about the rise of manufacturing, progressive educators, migration and immigration, behaviorism, intelligence testing, and categorization. So let's look at each of those just a little bit. So the rise in manufacturing, as manufacturing got big, it was all about efficiency and productivity. Like, how do we make these things faster and more efficient so we can make more money? And there was this pressure to create the future employees that could work at these companies. And those industry characteristics actually started to become models for schools. And then these things like specialization, chain of command, timed routines, and efficiencies, these are things that Feldman cites started to go from the workforce into schools. And then there were progressive educators like John Dewey and others who believed that education should be universal. It should be open to all. We should have a common curriculum. We should elevate the social and economic position of our students and support moral development. Feldman says, in the end, although Dewey's vision of schools as democratic engine provided overarching rhetoric about schools, it was often eclipsed by the vision of schools as training ground. So great ideas, but other things took precedence. And then there was migration and immigration, and the moves from rural living to cities as these factory jobs opened up and transportation got better. There were massive wave of immigrants from Western and then Eastern Europe. And this impacted our school systems. Feldman shares that while in 1820, there were only 4 US cities of populations over 25,000 people, 4 decades later, 40 years later, there were then 35 cities had populations of over 25,000, with 9 cities of over 100,000. Clearly, he says, the radical changes in the student population couldn't help but profoundly affect schools. And I did a little extra research and found that cities like New York went from 96,000 people in 1810 to 4.5 million people. That is giant growth. That is so much growth. Imagine how those schools changed with so many more students there. Boston went from 33,000 to 670,000. And here we only had 4 cities that were over 25,000 people in population, and it boomed well over 100 cities like that. So that really changed schools and the way teachers had to grade. And then there was intelligence testing and categorization that started to happen. There were these natural intelligence theories, whether we were or weren't born smart. Scientists were studying school size to determine if that would represent who is smarter. There were IQ tests believed to assess intellectual character, disposition, and even justify racist beliefs. Feldman says there were higher scores among white, wealthy Protestants and lower scores among immigrant groups and African Americans were used both to affirm the idea of the United States as a meritocracy and to reinforce the validity of the existing hierarchy. And then behaviorism, B.F. Skinner's rat experiments about operant conditioning. And this then resulted in people believing that human behavior is the result of external stimuli. So we know how that then affected schools. This theory of learning that humans could be taught to act in certain ways through extrinsic reinforcement or consequences became wildly popular in schools and factories. So how did these changes change schools? In particular, change our grading. One, kids were really looked at and it was enforced about obedience, being well behaved. It was a one-room schoolhouse. The teacher was really familiar with the students in his room, and there were narrative reports given to families more often than grades. And then in the 19th and 20th century, it was about assimilation. The immigrants, this large wave of immigrants were being trained to be good Americans. And sadly, Native American children were pulled from their homes and placed into boarding schools to make them Americans versus Americans, Indians. So assimilation caused a lot of changes in schools. And a little detour here, we have this idea of what average is, and we even grade and say that like a C is average. But the idea of average, man, it came in the early 19th century from a Belgian mathematician named Adolf Quetelet. And he actually used mathematics in astronomy to determine distance between stars. He used that averaging technique to average humans as he started to look at humans. And he decided that if he could figure out what the average was for humans, that would equal perfection. But then he had a protege who came named Francis Galton, and he wanted to say that average was in the middle and have classes to show that there was a higher class of people. So he ended up saying the average was mediocre. And that's kind of how we look at average today. But there is no average. And there's a fascinating book called The End of Average by Todd Rose that gets into that a little bit more. It's a really good read. The 20th century then brings sorting and ranking more. With larger public schools, the need for efficiency and accountability, the single letter grades showing up with the A to F, and norm reference grades and the bell curve. And another little detour here about letter grades. Letter grades were created by a guy named William Farish. He was a Cambridge University tutor, and he was interested in making more money. He figured if he could process more students in less time, he would make more money. So he got this idea to use this letter grade system that he saw in shoe factories that they would use to grade shoes. So that's where letter grades actually came from, the grading of shoes. And then I also was wondering, why is there no E in our letter grade system? Because apparently there was. But as the letter grades came to the US and colleges started to use them in the 1800s and then high schools in the 1900s, around the 1930s, they actually removed the E because they didn't want people to think that the E could represent excellent when it was really on the low end with failure. So continuing on with how we've been influenced with these IQ tests and research at the time, they started to track kids, and you've got the work track and the college track. And then we also ended up with some socioeconomic tracking and racial hierarchy tracking that influence schools. And even with all of that, our grades are still the same. It was focused on obedience, and we still focus on compliance with our grading sometimes. It used to be focused on assimilation of these immigrants, and it still is assimilation of everyone being a good citizen. And the sorting and ranking still shows up with bell curves used in some classes. And tracking, although it isn't used the way it was, we still do track kids on a vocational education track or a college track. And then with present day grading, Feldman says, we continue to place a premium on punctuality, quiet attention, and following directions, the same behaviors desired of students over a century ago. Grading hasn't really changed that much. And now with COVID-19 grading, we were told last spring, do no harm. And for me, the minute I heard that, I was like, yeah, so you're admitting that grades harm kids. And that's a problem. So when I think about all these things that have influenced education and grading practices, was our grading designed for our students to help them learn better, or for our stakeholders? And I think that's an important question to wonder, which brings me back to our guiding question: what's best for all students? Was grading faster, more efficient, best for all students is sorting and tracking kids, ranking them, judging them best for all students. So we're going to go back into a discussion group again. Now that we've got this rushed history of grading, and discuss how do you see the ideas and beliefs of the early 20th century manifesting themselves through your school's grading, maybe yours or others or the system as a whole. So we're going to send you off into groups of about 3 or 4 and go for about 7 minutes. Ready, Morgan?
Is underway once again.
Okay, so welcome back, folks, from the breakout group. So we were thinking while you were in the breakout group that it would be really interesting if you would be willing to think about one practice, one grading practice that you've experienced that reflects the early 20th century ideals and beliefs. Just list that one practice. And if you can't stand it, you need to list multiples, go ahead, it's okay. But if you could post that in the chat, what is a grading practice that you think still represents ideals and beliefs from a while ago? We've got grading on a curve, grading homework, zeros for missing work, late grades, percent off for late work again, GPAs, participation grades, rubrics even. Thanks for posting, they're coming in fast. Seat time, oh, that's so interesting. I agree. Grades for independent reading at home, late work again, weighted courses, honor roll, rewards for highest grades, whew. Letter grades, grading for effort, grades for doing the math, not grading for understanding, neatness, deadlines. Wow, you guys are good. Keep posting if you're still in that. Posting graded work in the room. Grades for effort, grades-based eligibility, extra credit, failing without concern for what a 25% does to an average, standardized test. Whew. Gosh, that's a lot. Thank you for posting those. Appreciate all of you that have contributed to that. There are so many practices that teachers still do today that were the same things that were done when we were in school and the same things that were done when those teachers were in school and on back because no one ever questions our grading practices. So this book, I think, is really going to contribute to your understanding of more current research. Valentine grades. All right, I have to stop. Michelle, what is a Valentine grade? Can you unmute?
Yeah, a Valentine grade is when you just give them a grade, like it doesn't represent any of their work. Like you want all your kids to pass so you don't have parents bothering you. So you just give everybody a 3.
Oh, like a little heart.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. That's true. That does happen sometimes. Oh, that's all someone said it. Debbie says it's also called blanket grading. Interesting. Well, thank you for that. Thanks for sharing. So I just want to move forward just a little bit. We're almost done, folks. It's 4:22. We're not going to open up this for a larger group discussion at this time because there's so little time left. But the cool thing about this book and this book study is that there's going to be a lot of time to dig into these practices and to think about these practices. And this book really sets the stage for that. So I think you're really going to enjoy digging into this book and coming back into these groups and getting to talk with other educators about the ideas and the concepts that Joe Feldman brings forth to us. So I'm going to close this chat for a minute. I was going to see if we had time for debrief, but I feel like we just aren't going to at this point in time. I want to make sure to honor folks' time here. I do want to share as well. I'm going to share something in the chat at the end here. And then if there's a few more minutes left and you want to stick around and ask questions, we can do that. But let me close up the slide for those folks that have other things to do today. First of all, as you move forward, your next question is thinking about how did you view grading prior to this book study? Thinking about yourself and your own practices, if you're still in the classroom, if you're no longer in the classroom, back when you were, and what is the purpose of grading, really, to think about that and see if you can clarify that for yourself. We ask that you do read and reflect on the prologue and chapters 1 and 2 before the next session. I think it's about 30 pages, but it's really fascinating and engaging. And our next webinar will be next Thursday, December 10th at 3:30 to 4:30. At that time, we'll preview chapters 3 and 4. This is where he makes his case for change, and he really digs into how grading isn't very effective or equitable at all and doesn't really help learning. I do want to also close with this quote from Feldman that came from these early chapters. He says, if we're going to understand our grading, question it, and find ways to improve it, particularly for vulnerable student populations, we need a basic understanding of its genealogy and its evolution. So I'm going to close this slideshow. I do want to share with you, I did a lot of reading and research because I did this book study once before, and I want to share with you an article. I'm going to share this link to this this newsletter put out by the Maine Council for English Language Arts. I did an article, I called it In Search of More Equitable Grading, where I have not only shared stuff that you heard from today, but also my own thoughts about my practice and where I want to go and head. So I'm going to share that link in the chat for you if you're interested in that. And at this point, if you have other things to do and other places to go.
Hold on, before you go, Patty's going to post that link, and I'm going to post the link for where you go to give us feedback and to get your certificate for participation today. So I will also send it to you in an email, but sometimes it's nice to do it immediately as soon as you're done.
So now I want to give you the freedom to leave. If you have other things to do, if you would like to unmute and ask a question or share a thought. Hello, Freddie. Hello, Freddie.
You say hi.
That's my colleague Renee's little guy, Freddie. But yes, anybody who wants to say something or share something, please do. Now's your chance. I'm going to stick around for another few minutes. And again, feel free to go. We're tired this year.
Yeah.
We've been working hard.
Thank you.
So I am going to end the recording here, and we'll just stick around to chat with whoever would like to chat. And thank you all for coming. And Patty, thank you so very much for doing this for us.